Last week we went over the lore of a Rhodian senator in the New Republic whose only chance at not being one of the galaxy's worst war criminals came from him being created as a typo. But this is far from the only character or other bit of Star Wars content which originated from that kind of mistake. Even just within the movies, one Jedi was created this way, and he played an important, if invisible, role. This was Jedi Master Ciphod Diaz. If you read the original script of Attack of the Clones, originally Ciphod Diaz was a different guy named Ciphod Diaz. Instead of being a real Jedi whom had died, this was supposed to be a false name of Palpatine and a reference to his Sith title, a hint of who had actually ordered the clone army. A typo in one place in the script resulted in Ciphod Diaz, which, at least as the story goes, George decided he liked more than Ciphod Diaz, and so a brand new Jedi was born. For what it's worth, I probably prefer this to Sidious deciding Ciphod Diaz was a good undercover name for him. But our next character takes us a little bit further back into the earlier days of the expanded universe, where Courtship of Princess Leia introduced a character named Hecken as the president of the Alderaanian Council, basically the government of the planetless Alderaanian people, who later resettled on New Alderaan. When the Hapens petitioned Leia to marry Princess Solder and become the eventual Queen of the Hapens, both Horm and the New Republic were enthusiastic about the prospect. For the New Republic, this would mean a new ally in the Hapens, and for the Alderaanians, this would mean a potential new homeworld for them within the Star Cluster. These marriage plans fell through, but when Kevin J. Anderson wrote the Jedi Academy trilogy, he intended to have this character return so that he could like this video and subscribe for more, but also to serve as a senator working on the New Republic's Inner Council, who pushed for Kip Durin to get the death penalty for blowing up Karita, yet another core world which had exploded as a result of good old Imperial engineering and Sith Lords. Instead of Threckenhorm, however, Anderson had called the character Hecken Thorm. Rather than leaving this typo as it was, calling it a mistake and moving on, which frankly would have been entirely understandable, both names are entirely ridiculous, they decided to retcon him as a new character, being the senator from the Fedali system instead of Alderaan. That part at least is probably for the best, since Leia was already the Alderaanian senator. There's a lot of instances where authors really don't understand the difference between being a local leader versus being a representative in the federal government. Basically, people in one appearance serve as a mayor, and in the next they're treated as a congressperson or, well, senator, despite theoretically being in the same position as before. But in any case, the original Horm then appeared in Tatooine Ghost by Troy Denning, where he was killed. Our next example is a little different in that this typo was somewhat more intentional, and even more interestingly, it was in-universe. This was a Sith Lord named Darth Riven. Riven, who lived sometimes during the 1,000-year New Sith Wars between 2000 and 1000 BBY, likely closest to the third quarter of that period, given that we know he precedes Dark Lady Belia Darzu, who dies around 1230 BBY, and is called an intermediary between him and Lord Khan. But Riven, who was active in the Kularan system, took his name from a corrupted recording of the ancient Sith Lord Darth Revan. My reading of this is that Riven knew that this was kind of a corrupted display, but thought it sounded cool, instead of him just being kind of stupid, but I don't think that's conclusive. He built a fortress on the planet Almas, which was the home of a Jedi Academy that chose to sit out of the Clone Wars later on, and he used this fortress as a training ground for elite Sith Battlelords. This fortress, built out of Mandalorian lightsaber-resistant Beskar, was kitted out with enough traps to make it seem like a dungeon in a tabletop RPG setting, because that's exactly what it was. To that end, Riven was also given a special weapon called the Dark Staff, which has a far more interesting and complete history than Riven himself, after several other appearances and mentions in other media. Riven was driven off of Almas by the Jedi, and although he survived, he was presumably killed by his own apprentice Darson. Or was he? Planets have this happen all the time, although it's usually in less important places. For example, we have the worlds of Theosia and Thealia. The Black Fleet Crisis trilogy introduced the xenophobic Yavithans, but less importantly, it also had an offhand reference by Lando Calrissian to a monarch called the Blood Prince of Thealia, used basically in the context of, I don't care if the King of England asks for it. Much later on, it was then referenced in the RPG supplement Friends Like These as the Blood Prince of Thealia. I'm really trying to make sure I get all of the right words in the right place for all of these examples, but they're all so close that I'm almost certain I've messed it up somewhere already. But Theosia and Thesalia were officially split into two different planets by an update to the Essential Atlas, and neither of these planets was ever really used again. Outbound Flight by Timothy Zahn had a similar typo result in a new planet. Between the planets Swolriep and Sularine, which do you think was a typo of the other? Yes, naturally, Sularine was the typo and Swolriep was the intended spelling. This actually goes a bit further back, where the sector had appeared as both Swolriep and Sularine incorrectly at different times. It was officially stated that Sularine was never intended as a sector name, despite it being used a bunch first before Sularine the planet, but then they allowed Sularine the planet to exist. Not every case of a typo like this gets officially turned into something new, but even in those cases, fans will often pretty concretely separate the typo-originated object into its own thing. This is what I think is the best description of what happens with the Zebulon Bee, a frigate mentioned once in the novel Hard Merchandise. This is basically a Nebulon Bee, but with the N turned sideways to make a nice Canadian Z, and which has been given its own Wikipedia article. I don't think there was another mention of it anywhere, so I think this one could still fit within the category of just typos in a book that were intended to be the original thing that never actually got split off, but it has its own Wikipedia page, so I'm counting it here. And sometimes there are persistent typos which are always acknowledged as just being a typo, despite turning up in almost every bit of media where a thing is referenced, with a great amount of self-control, keeping authors and others from even considering making the typo into a new thing. This has one major example, Keldabe or Kadalbe, two different spellings for the Mandalorian capital and ship type from Forces of Corruption. At this point, I'm not even sure if there's a correct way to spell it unless you go with the primacy of the first appearance, but I have no personal interest in knowing what that is. I have intentionally never looked it up because I prefer the mystery. If I don't know what it is, I can never be held responsible for saying or typing the wrong one. But finally, we're going to talk about a bit of a bonus category, planets which may not actually be the result of typos, but which certainly feel like they are. In the Thrawn trilogy and the X-Wing novels, there's a planet which gets mentioned a couple times named Mrist, M-R-I-S-S-T. It doesn't really do much, but it did eventually get included in the strategy game Star Wars Rebellion as well. When the X-Wing comics started releasing, they included a new planet called Mrlst, M-R-L-S-S-T. Technically, there's no reference to these two being the same planet, but given their provenance, with both kind of coming from the Thrawn trilogy, then the X-Wing for Mrist, and then the X-Wing comics for Mrlst, I wouldn't be surprised if Mrlst originated as an intent to represent Mrist. But every time it's mentioned in the comics, which is a lot, it does intentionally have the L. So it may have been because whatever documents the writers were looking at with the planet names had the lowercase I kind of bleeding into itself, looking like a lowercase l. It's much easier to make that mistake with all of the letters being lowercase than the kind of uppercase comic typefacing. As an extra bonus for this category, there's a third planet which just drops the I and the L along with the R called Mist, M-S-S-T. This one was the home planet of a Jedi named Brachus, who turned out to in fact be a servant of the Emperor. On the similarly annoying end of the spectrum, we did also end up with two planets with the exact same name, called Bis, in different parts of the galaxy with different characterizations, something not dissimilar to the kerfuffle over the location of the planet and axis. Whether the Bis case getting treated as two different planets ultimately ends up making that better or worse than the Anaxis situation, I don't know. Either way though, that's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed this look into the messy history of Star Wars typos. Thank you for watching, remember to like and subscribe, as well as to turn on the bell to be notified when more of this human-generated, non-AI slop gets released. Special thanks to Marmar for editing this video. I've got a long one coming up, a 25-minute video next week, hopefully, on the controversy and philosophy of Vergere, so I hope you're looking forward to that one too.